All right. It is hotter than the devil's butthole out here right now, but I wanted to at least try to put something out here today. I'm sure this time of day it'll be a while before anybody sees it because, well, it is quitting time on Friday afternoon. People, enjoy your weekend. I wanted to talk about one of the things that makes uh, guerrilla self protection. I don't know if it's different, but for sure useful. And, there are other people who do other things that are similar and related and all that. So what works kind of generally works. Of course, we all have our own thing, and we like to think we're doing something truly unique. But in any case, one of the things that I do that I really enjoy about guerrilla self-protection is we do a lot of deficit training. And we spend time working from the deficit. I got to wave to the neighbors. Working from the deficit to recovery, and that's a big thing because the way that predators work uh, is that they take control of social norms and they abuse them and stretch them, and so we can just be trying to be nice, and people can be working to take advantage of that basically. And so being able to work from a deficit also teaches us what to recognize, what things to see, and we in guerrilla self-protection anyway, we're working to also put in signs of threat, signs of danger, what I would call imminent threat signs, and de-escalation and awareness and all that stuff. So I just don't want to talk about that too much. That's covered, and I'll probably talk about it at another time. This is really just about deficit training. So what is the value of deficit training? What do I actually mean by deficit training? For example, working from a deficit is essentially like, or metaphorically like, starting college with $150,000 debt and then taking on more loans in order to finish college, and working through life to pay that crap off. That's obviously a metaphor. It's a little bit tough. It's a hard pill to swallow. Nobody would want to do that. Nobody would volunteer to do that. But what you would learn in the process is how to be financially accountable. At least let's hope, right? You would learn how to deny yourself. You would get self-discipline. You would learn how to spot opportunities and things like that. Basically, if things weren't handed to you, how would you make do? And more than that, if you had to work from any kind of a deficit, which is the purpose, of course, you have a hand above somebody who always thinks that they're going to have things sorted out for them. What do I mean? I'm trying to formulate a good way to talk about this metaphorically, but it's just I'm struggling. It's Friday afternoon. Basically, deficit training is working, for example, from a space that is too close, that is uncomfortable, that is difficult for you to have the time that you would need to be able to counter or even move away, where it is so close that you essentially only have the time to react. And that reaction process is almost always going to be base, instinctual, and there's not a lot you can really do about it. You can talk about arming it, and we will try to do that to some extent, but the reality is that deficit training is always going to be something that you are working from surprise or from being taken off guard, and then working to try to regain some sort of normalcy, or at least normalcy, for sure not continue to remain in a deficit, and then potentially, hopefully, working to a positive outcome from that deficit. And why would that be important? Well, again, because you will not generally, in a self-defense, self-protection situation that is what I would consider to be kind of an oh shit moment, you will not generally have the warning that you need in order to respond. So you have to have something that's very instinctual, and you have to be able to work from that deficit. So we work a lot on, close quarters. We work a lot on, and when I say close quarters, I don't even mean arm's length. I mean almost at elbow range. I mean pretty close. And that is what I would call intimate space. It's the normal conversation with somebody if you wanted to be a little bit quieter. So that would be an extreme. That wouldn't be probably normal for you to invite somebody into that space if they were not a friend. But the reality is, particularly if you're a woman, a lot of what you confront, particularly with sexual assault and things of that sort, abuse and that, is all going to be with somebody that you are either acquainted with or is an actual loved one. So, a husband, for example. It's about 50% of the time it's going to be some sort of intimate partner. And so you're going to be familiar enough with them to be at that working space. And that's uncomfortable for the majority of us. And so what I work a lot on with guerrilla self-protection is getting people to understand that, getting people to work in that, really trying to get them to stay in it as much as possible and be able to grow and develop from it. And the one of the things about that is that it's much more difficult to work from that space. So how I explain that to people when they get kind of frustrated, and some people don't get frustrated, but they'll just bail out. They try to move away and they try to get space, and that's all very legitimate things you can do. But for the training, I want you to suck it up, and I want you to stay in close, because that is often where the most violent things occur, is in that intimate space. And so learning to deal with violence at the intimate space level is what the majority of us need. Now, when you're talking about voluntary violence, which is more commonly termed social violence, I call it voluntary violence because you have to volunteer to stay there. You have to be volunteering to be a part of it. So for me, it's just a reminder that it's something that I have an opportunity to walk away from and I don't take it, or I put myself in a position that now is screwed. And so in those instances, you're going to have more space. And the beauty of learning to fight in the intimate space range is that those spaces, the extra space you get from like a social violence situation where you're dueling essentially, is such a advantage for you if you've learned already to deal with the uncomfortable, difficult, close space where complexity of attack is much, much higher. So I got to read your thing, Robster. I'm just going to read it out loud so everybody knows what it is. It's weird that statistically women will be attacked more likely by a loved one than a stranger, and yet this is most often either overlooked or catches them by surprise. Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the struggles, right? And that's why I really think it's important to work from deficit, because there are a lot of good people doing some cool stuff out there. And when you talk about situational awareness and environmental awareness, threat awareness, things like that, that's all cool. And, and it's generally it's all valid, right? But the reality is that when you're talking about interpersonal violence, a lot of that shit doesn't really do you a ton of good unless, you know, there are tics or triggers that you become familiar with. For example, in one of the stories that's included in the new Guerrilla Self-Protection book on sexual violence, the woman described how she knew if she was going to be sexually assaulted or abused as a child growing up, whether because of how her father was acting. She knew that if he had taken drugs, I think this is right. I could be wrong, but I think this is right. If he had taken drugs, she was going to be sexually abused. If he had been drinking and was drunk, he was going to be violent. And if that's flipped, whatever. Anyway, the context is still the same, which is that there's a way for her to be situationally aware, but it's still going to be interpersonal violence space. So you're still not going to be able to walk away from it. You're still not going to have the space to do anything about it, really, particularly as a child or a younger person, you know. And a lot of times we can see shit developing, and we still, because so much has already been put into play, it's still difficult to like make things not happen. So situational awareness is hugely important, but it still doesn't absolve you from the need for the study of violence, basically violent reaction. So, hey, thanks for joining. So I just think that, you know, for me, working from deficit is critical mass. You know, I've been involved for almost 30 years, and over 25 of that has been CLOT and FMA and things like that, and exclusively pentoxylot for 20-some years, where I just dropped everything else that I was doing, and specifically the style that I created or whatever. So the whole purpose, though, was for me to like get into it and get deep and get real skills and not waste time with distracting things. It was more about a study of myself, right? If I force myself, if I restrict myself to stay within a boundary, then I have no other choice but to get good at that. And that was kind of what I did. And it was very intentional. I decided not to take on anything else. I didn't look at anything else. I just focused on what I do to find answers for the things I needed answers for. And it admittedly was absolutely the best method. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't learn that idea. It wasn't my idea. I mean, I learned it from a art teacher. I had an art teacher in college who said, hey, all semester, all you're going to do is one painting for a postcard, and you're going to have to submit the postcard, and, you know, if it gets selected or whatever, you win a prize, whatever. But for the whole semester, I just did one illustration. And to this day, it's probably one of my better illustrations, if not my best illustration, because I spent the whole damn semester doing it, redoing it, and getting it right. Then I had another art teacher who said, okay, for the whole semester, I want you to take one street corner or whatever, anything you wanted, but no, I think it was a street. I think he forced everybody to do a street corner. And you have to take, 3 rolls of, obviously I'm old, right? I had rolls of film. But you had to take 3 rolls of film every week, develop them, and, pick your best photos, do a critique for the week of just that one street corner for the whole semester. I got actually some really interesting photos out of that process, and it was a boring, shitty ass, less than interesting street corner, which I think was his intent, right? I mean, man, 3 weeks into it, and we were just all dying as a class. But that exercise in both of those situations taught me that if I learn to work within a category of boundaries, then I can really get deeper than I ever thought possible. And so the whole deal that I do with guerrilla self-protection is to work from deficit. And how I do that, one of the ways, is through 3x3 space. So you are required to learn how to do what you need to do within a 3x3 space. And that means for both parties. So it's really freaking close. And, you know, a lot of times we will kind of get outside of that. But the goal is to not, and is to stick in the hole and to freaking grit it out. And how I tell guys, you know, I have guys who've been with me 15 years, 16 years, you know, whatever, training with me, and, you know, I see them wanting to bail out, and I'm like, look, I realize that's comfortable, right, to bail out of the 3x3 and to get space. And you should absolutely do this in real fighting, but A, you don't always have that option, and B, if you learn to stick in the hole, you will lose, and you will lose, and you will lose until you start winning. And when you start winning, you know, every time you've lost, you've grown, and you have to get better. So you know, take it as a self-challenge, and stop with this dueling protagonist mentality, and start to just suck it up and eat the bitter and grow, and be intentional about growing yourself. I should not have to tell you to voluntarily stay in a 3x3. If you want to grow, set boundaries for yourself, work within those boundaries, even if they're unrealistic, even if they're horrible boundaries. If you set a boundary of 1,200 calories a day, there's no doubt that in day 2 or 3 or 4, you're going to be hungry as hell. The value of it, though, is over the course, right? You start to lose weight. Now, that's really low, and I don't recommend that unless you're a woman and you're pretty inactive. But anyway, point being, there will be benefit from it. Too much restriction, of course, you can cause harm, right, to yourself, psychologically, physically, whatever. So, you know, a little bit of balance is good. But if I set boundaries for myself, they're rarely, boundaries that I set for myself are rarely so restrictive that I'm harming myself. They're most likely not to be restrictive enough. So I got to read your comment, Robster. I've seen it, but I just got to read it. It's interesting how the brain works. When it sees a need to survive, it can recognize, I have a hard time because of my sunglasses, patterns that you know that will you know the outside, so to better increase your survival. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in that, and honestly, like, deficit training is such a, there are ways to do deficit training that mostly I've used space in one context or another. The 3x3 with a live drill, right? Like, I don't know what this person is going to attack me with ever, in the way that we drill with guerrilla self-protection. They're going to start, and I'm going to start to learn what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing, and that's going to create, every time, a little bit of a adrenaline dump. I mean, not like noticeably, but you get a little cortisol every time you're under stress. And so when I'm not sure what they're going to do, I don't have my hands in a ready position, every time I'm like, throw a punch, do whatever you're going to do, you know. And you know, some people are pretty predictable, you know, they don't change much, but there are people who will, and so you're always getting that little bit of a stress pressure testing type thing every time we drill, because it's a live drill, it's not a static drill. We're specifically creating, we're specifically working through a live drill to create scenarios, I guess, you know. So yeah, it is great fun. I mean, to me, like, the whole process of this has been amazing. I actually started to say this and got totally distracted by everything else. So after, you know, nearly 30 years in martial arts, and so many of those in CLOT, I've discovered that that this deficit training that I'm doing right now challenges the shit out of me, and I'm loving it because I'm growing so much. Everything that every time every day basically I learn how to improve my stuff, and I'm doing it under stress because I got to live adapt, and I have to spatially adapt, and all the techniques that you learn. Man, so much of that just goes out of the window. And after the fact, I'm like looking at things, and I'm going, oh, I could have added this, I could have done that. I know that from this position I can do X, Y, Z, but I don't do it because there's pressure and there's stress. It isn't that the technique is bad, it's that I haven't pressed myself to do those things under pressure, and so they don't show up. So that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned, even though I've always been a proponent that a martial art should be first martial and maybe never art. That violence in itself is beautiful when it's done well. So I don't need to be flowery to make myself happy. That's not my purpose. So to me, all of the flower, the panchak, to me is for myself directly is sila. So that's for you, Robster, just because you're here and there's not too many other people here. So I just gotta take my lap. Loving your concept and journey with the deficiency training. You're on a great path, and thanks for sharing and bringing everyone along for the ride. Yeah, well, I'm hopeful, right? I mean, I'm getting, I get a lot of people interested, and what I run into is a lot of people who have never experienced it really don't understand what to do with it. People who have had karate backgrounds and whatever, or they've had nothing but passive drills. Man, FMA is like littered with passive drilling. I spent 12 years in FMA and doing aggressive, hard drilling that was all passive. And by passive, I mean mutual, right? Everybody's drilling together. And I mean hard, like smoking sticks kind of hard training. And it just doesn't... it helps build that hand-eye coordination, but it doesn't give you any sense of real space, and it doesn't give you any sense of spatial control, and all this stuff. So unless you can figure out how to break all that stuff, all the passive drilling in the world doesn't teach you fighting. So deficit training so far has been the best. And there's been some really interesting things. So for example, one of my guys right now who's the most consistent in attending class doesn't have very much training in martial arts. He's been with me a year and a half maybe. He doesn't think he's very good. He's always like a little bit of Eeyore, but he's actually he's done pretty well, and he's doing pretty well. But his height, he's about 6 inches shorter than me, and the vast majority of real fighting I've done has been with bigger dudes, 6'7", etc., heavier, longer reach, all that. And when I started doing some pressure testing with him, I realized I have spent so much time fighting bigger dudes because that was always my fear, I guess, that when I got into fighting a shorter dude, it was weird. I couldn't hit some of the shit I was used to hitting because he's freaking shorter. And so I'm like, well, how do I adjust for that? And you're trying to adjust while you're in a live drill and specifically do something. That's really freaking hard to do. But I want to keep doing it. I want like more of it. I can't get enough. So I love it. But yeah, it's really interesting. Even though I'm only picking like, you're gonna work to hand on a punch instead of elbow, defending, and you're gonna hand on a punch and guide it and strike, counter strike. I'm just trying to explain it verbally. I have words for stuff, but it won't necessarily make sense. But you're going to do what I would call a hand entry. So, it's going to be a right hand entry or a left hand entry. You get to pick and you get to work from side to side, and the deficit is like, I'm forcing you to have to do this every time, and you just have to sit there and deal with my attacking until you can get it done. And then I'm going to keep attacking after that. So it never stops just because you succeed. I just hesitate because I got hit, and then I just keep coming. And it's really, some of it's been really cool because it's really challenging, What's up? I gotta look at this. Love how everyone jumps on these bandwagons. Years ago it was Krav Maga, then MMA. Now it's Krav Maga, taking knife and stick concept from SEALAT and FMA. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. But I mean, even FMA has done it. FMA has stolen like crazy. They're like, oh, well, SEALAT's hot right now, so I do, FMA SEALAT, whatever, dude. Kali SEALAT. I see it. Oh my God, so many times. It's like, dude, I'm not your tail end, right? Like, SEALAT will stand on its own. It's got its own weapons like crazy. Not every SEALAT system is good. Not every SEALAT teacher is good. Not every, practitioner is good. They all are context, right? And FMA is kind of the same way. There are good teachers, bad teachers, good systems, bad systems. I use bad systems really to refer to limitations, and more than actually bad. They could be very good at what they specialize in, but that doesn't mean they're useful for street. And again, my comparative is always that martial arts should be martial as art, not like martial and art. So for me, if it's not functionally useful in the United States of America where I freaking live, then it's not functionally useful. Period. I don't fucking walk around a jungle. I can't chop a rattan stick and and I don't fucking carry machetes. So, I gotta figure out how to make it useful for me. I don't like, and I learned all of those things. I learned from SEALAT teachers. I didn't learn them from anybody else. I never learned any of that from an FMA teacher. I never learned that from a Kung Fu teacher. I never learned that from a Kung Tao teacher. The only person that ever taught me to make shit work for me was SEALAT teachers. Ever. They were always like, yeah, I went to Indonesia and trained, and the guy that I was there with, I'll just leave him unnamed for now. I had trained with his older brother who was more senior in the system. That's irrelevant, but they looked different to the point where I was not sure what I was actually seeing was the same stuff to some extent. And there was a third guy who also taught me while I was in Indonesia, and his looked even more different. But apparently it was more representative of what they had both been taught originally. More standardized, I guess. And it was interesting, though, because they both were like, yeah, you can emphasize weapons use or empty hand use, or weapons and empty hand use. You can emphasize the beauty of it, or you can emphasize the violence of it, and you can think about applications because it's movement. It's not fixed technique. So all of that clicked in my head as like, I got to make this shit work, really. Like, at the end of the day, this is about making shit work, and if it doesn't work, I shouldn't be doing it. And what that really meant to me was not like, oh, I pressure test this technique, and if it doesn't work, I don't use it. It's more like, it's movement, right? Movement itself is not sacred, so that's irrelevant. There is no magic movements that suddenly you're now capable to fucking use, and so it's all just freaking moving. And so if you can move and you can apply in your context as needed, you're doing SEALAT, really, at least in the way that I frame it. does it have to be from, if you call it something, then it should represent that something. But for myself, that's why I stepped out on my own and did my own thing. I created something that I felt like worked for working class people who, like myself, who aren't ever going to be, 8, 6, 10 hours a day, every day, training, so they can be amazing because they travel around and teach everybody and their cousin how to do what they do, even though those people will never do it because they're too freaking good because they train all the fucking time. I expect people to train 4 hours a week, and 2 of those are on their own. Now, I personally loved it, so I trained daily, 2 to 4 hours, and usually from 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night on until I just couldn't do it anymore. Go to work, do the same thing. So the idea for me was to create something that was simple, that was effective, that represented the ideas, concepts, and basics that I saw within Penchak Silat. My deficit in that context was then to think in terms of simplicity. What can I communicate effectively that I think will actually help people today? So there's different kinds of deficits, right? Like the deficit I was using then was, if you come to my class today, I want you to be able to have a hope of using what I teach you today right now, not in a year. And so that's always been kind of my guiding principle. So my Silat's not fancy. It doesn't look really cool or flashy. It certainly is not super attractive. There are some very attractive people out there who have made up a lot of stuff, and that's cool. Good for you. But it's not really, what's up, Marcy? But that's not really for me. The thing for me is the deficit, right? What can I take away to make this more efficient? How can I hold myself accountable within the shitstorm? And how can I work from the shitstorm to put myself in a position of advantage? And that's really what deficit is about, personal growth. And it's recognizing that, like I said, most of the time, women, girls, children really are at a deficit from the start. This is supposed to be somebody that loves them, that will care for them, that they trust. And they're being abused by them, exploited by them, taken advantage of by them. If that's not a deficit, then I don't freaking know what is. So forcing yourself to work from a deficit and losing face a little bit. I'm going to wait for this loud-ass truck to go by. And losing face a little bit because you're losing in class. Man, shut up. Suck it up. Yeah, no business whining about that. There are people who actually live in deficit every day. Every freaking day. Think about a trafficked kid who's having sex 20 times a day. I mean, that's probably light, honestly, from some of the stories that I've heard. And we're worried about a little deficit training in our martial arts program, a self-protection program. Shut the front door. Like, seriously. You have no concept of a deficit if this little pressure from having somebody attack you with mitts on or gloves on bothers you. So, I'm all about it. I love deficit training. This thing to me is all about it. If you get involved with me in guerrilla self-protection, you're going to lose. Period. You are going to lose. There's no question at some point you're going to get hit in the face, probably many times. You're going to get boxed in the ears. You're going to probably get a fat lip. You're probably going to bite your tongue. I know that's not very comforting, but it's scalable, right? Like, I don't have to... my goal is not to beat anybody up. My goal is to grow you and help you grow yourself. So sometimes that means you take a fat lip. That's what it is. A bruised arm, a bruised leg, whatever. Nobody's dying from that. If you can't handle that, then you damn sure can't handle trying to help a kid who's being raped 20 times a day. So, context is king. This deficit training for us is nothing compared to the deficit a lot of people face. So, anyway, that's it. That's my rant. I'll shut up. If you got anything to add, man, put it down there. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks, Robster and Marcy. And there's another guy on there, but I don't know. I can't read his name anymore. Scrolled off. Love to you guys. Peace.